Elizabeth Dias, thank you so much for joining me and Susan Wokoma on The Guilty Feminist. This is the recording after the live recording, which we did with the wonderful Jane Bradley. Hello, Jane Bradley.
Hello.
Elizabeth, can you just introduce yourself and tell us what you do at the New York Times?
Hello. This is so exciting to be here. I'm Elizabeth Dias. I cover religion and politics for the New York Times. So that's everything from the topic we're going to talk about today to the new pope to anything else going on in Washington and the US, it seems, right now.
So you must be quite busy at the moment if you cover religion and politics in America for the New York Times.
It's true. It does seem that religion is basically everything at this point. But it's also been that way now for, gosh, it seems nearly a decade. So we're rolling with it. We're going.
Now, I am extremely interested in Christian nationalism, how it's pervaded American politics and how it is continuing to grow within the US, and how it seems to be being exported to the UK and across Europe and other parts of the world, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, etc. What's going on with it from your point of view, Elizabeth?
It's interesting. Christian nationalism is a term that gets sort of bandied around a lot. It's actually not one that I use discreetly in my reporting, because I find that at least here it can mean a lot of different things to different people. So I tend to talk about the actions that the Christian right, which is increasingly powerful and changing a lot in the Trump era here, is doing. And that's a set, it can range from all kinds of things that they're doing to make Christianity more powerful, specifically their kind of Christianity. And even more specifically, it leads to the ending for many of in this world. It's intentionally working to end the separation of church and state that we have here in the United States.
How successful are they being at ending the divide between church and state?
The wall between the two is eroding. And there are many in that world are celebrating that success. And we've been hearing in the last couple of years overt calls to weaken that wall or to redefine sort of revisionist looking back at what it actually should be. So we're seeing cases in the Supreme Court here to elevate the place of Christianity, or that's the functional effect of these decisions is to raise the profile and power specifically of Christian communities here in the US. We're certainly seeing within the Trump administration and the executive branch here efforts to do that. And there's also, of course, in Congress, and the Speaker of the House here in Congress is Mike Johnson, who actually was a lawyer working with the group some years ago that Jane and I wrote about in our investigation that you guys have already talked about. So it's quite pervasive and dynamic. There's groups out in the states that are collaborating even in the last 5 years to bring Christian lawmakers at all levels together in order to strategize and to figure out how to intentionally move forward in their ambitions. And it's causing a lot of conflict, as you might expect, with increasingly secular and religiously unaffiliated parts of America.
What's the difference between Christianity and Christian nationalism? Just for our listeners who may be hearing that and going, oh, is this excluding Christians or feminists who have some kind of faith or faith-based community?
Right. So I think there's a tendency to think of Christianity as a singular thing. I actually have come to talk about it as a plural thing, right? I mean, and this has been this way over time. I actually went to seminary. I'm a nerd like that. I spent way too much time studying the history of Christianity specifically. And, there's always been conflicts and fights and divisions and various communities in Christianity based on culture, language, politics, all of this. But at a very basic level, you can look at the way that the Roman Catholic Church expresses its Christianity and is, literally was an empire, right, for many centuries. And that's different than the reactionary movements, at the time of the Protestant Reformation. You guys can tell us all about that over there in the UK.
Sure.
And
Sure.
and then
very much the history of England, but also very much the history of Northern Ireland.
And here, there's a lot of story. You go back to the Puritans, you go back to why people came over here, the stories they share about why they wanted different kinds of religious freedom, is how especially we're hearing them talk about it now, coming to the US. And so the history of the United States is, of course, tied up in the story of Christianity in this country as well. But there's also, you use the term Christian nationalism. I talk about kind of right-wing Christian power, which is a political movement here. And it has a very specific ideology. I look for action distinctions because I think it can get quite murky depending on who you're talking to. And here, that term emerged more recently as almost a slur against this kind of ideology from the left. So in order for me to talk about it, I like to just look at like the actions that people are doing. And this is where you see the expressions of Christianity being quite different. And there are now self-described Christian nationalists in the US. I mean, they've embraced that term intentionally and are leaning into it. But one of the main actions that I look at is, are you trying to end the separation of church and state? Are you trying to elevate the place of your Christian ideology above others, right? And what does that actually look like? So there are Christians here who are speaking out quite strongly against this expression of Christianity and the harm that they see it bringing. I mean, we see that in everything from immigration and the ICE raids going on. We've got pastors being arrested and standing literally like in front of the immigration courts and on the streets. We see we had a very prominent Episcopal bishop, a woman who leads the archdiocese here in Washington at the National Cathedral during the President Trump's inaugural prayer service, which was this past January. She gave a very bold sermon begging him to be merciful and think of God's mercy, and was absolutely raked through the coals by the pastors who support him for that. But it was an extremely galvanizing moment for the many, many millions of Christians who feel that their faith has been completely hijacked by this movement here. So it's really a power struggle, and it's a political one.
Now, in the United States, as far as I can make out, each presidential candidate has to at least claim to be Christian and be seen to be a churchgoer to be elected. That is not the case in the UK. If anything, if somebody is too overtly religious, it's more difficult for them to get elected. Like Tony Blair became Catholic, but quite famously left it to the end of his prime ministership after he'd stepped down because he didn't want to be seen to be a prime minister who was talking to God, because people would go, hey, hold on, are you ruling by going and having a chat with your friend in the sky? Because that's between you and your faith. We don't mind it, but we don't want it to be too overt. Now, so how have Christian nationalists set their sights on the United Kingdom, which is largely a secular country, or at least a secular country in governance? We do like church and state super far apart. I know it's weird because our monarch is the head of the Church of England and also technically the head of the country. But it's sort of almost, we put that over there with fancy dinners, crowns, all the Hogwarts stuff is also where we put God. So it's sort of like, look, we do have a lot of funny stuff here. We have got a sorting hat. That's where we put God in with that stuff. And then our prime minister is someone we can make fun of. So what we do is we separate our head of state from whoever's in charge, where we can go, you're doing it wrong. In America, you've got Mr. President, Mr. President, Mr. President, who is both head of state and also in charge. So I think that's how we've managed to do it, because we realised that having someone like King Henry VIII in charge wasn't working for us. So
also for women, I don't know that it worked out so well for women.
You definitely don't want to be a woman who King Henry VIII thinks might make a nice wife. That's certainly true. So how have Christian nationalists and the MAGA elite decided that the United Kingdom would be a good target for Christian nationalism and put their energy into us?
Mm-hmm. Jane and I heard a lot when we were reporting this story about the fear and like actual deep concern that many on the Christian right who were involved and are involved in working to end abortion rights ultimately globally. I mean, in the UK, but also globally. They spoke to us a lot about the fear of the UK not being Christian enough, and it's something that I hear, even coming out of the White House here, and this idea of, in a strain in the State Department, where this ideology is strong, and even in Congress, that the UK has sort of abandoned its Christian roots, and this is the end of Western civilization, and
Wow.
they in the United States must come to change that and literally like resurrect Christianity in public spaces. So it's very tied in, which made the investigation that we did was fascinating and kind of hard to untangle, because what is the political ambition and what is religiously motivated and how does that work? But I'm hearing that even a few days ago, I was texting Jay and saying, oh my goodness, look, there's another visit from the State Department going over to the UK talking about these themes, and it really is existential. And I mean, one of the things that I always remember in my reporting on religion is that so many of the people involved see themselves in a story that spans centuries, right? They're not just talking about political cycle or this is happening 2 years ago or we want this in 5 years from now. When they tell the story of their goals, you hear them talk about the first century and Jesus and the disciples, and in many Catholic communities, then you hear about different popes, right, going along, and the progression of the role of the church in the Western world. So it's extremely deep, and I think that's one thing that's important for people who are unfamiliar with this to really keep in mind. It's utterly serious, and people really do mean what they say and their goals. And one of the things with the way that the movement to end abortion rights in the US was so successful is that it thought in these generational lifetime terms, and it gave them a political strength that their opponents just absolutely did not see coming at all.
And I just wanted to jump in because, Deborah, since we last spoke, on Friday, I don't know if you saw the news, but there was a really interesting document released by the US as part of its kind of its national security strategy. And
yes,
it was incredible because, what the Trump administration came out and said is that Europe is facing, and I quote here, kind of a stark prospect of civilizational erasure. And it basically pledged that it would help these kind of like-minded, patriotic, that's their word, parties across Europe to kind of secure a future that they would like the look of. And it doesn't go as far as quoting name-checking reform, but, how it talks about kind of these patriotic parties that the US should be cultivating, using to cultivate resistance across Europe. It's parties that fight against migration and promote nationalism. In the UK, that's reform, let's face it. And it kind of said the quiet part out loud, which is what we were kind of talking about earlier, which is the US is increasingly, not just the ADF and the anti-abortion movement, but the US from Trump down is increasingly seems to be seeing its mission as correcting culture and politics and its vision of the world far outside of its borders in Europe, in Venezuela, and elsewhere. And I think what it shows is that, as we said earlier, like if we were talking about Russia, obviously it's a hostile state, so there's a difference there, but we would be calling this foreign interference. And this national security strategy, basically lays out a foreign interference strategy.
Yeah, I quoted it on my Instagram story and said, this is what we've been talking about on the Road to Gilead series, on the Guilty Feminist, that they're trying to king make Nigel Farage, which was your turn of phrase. And I was like, oh, so have they been listening to the Road to Gilead? And they're like, they know. Jane Bradley's told them, we're just going to come out with it, presumably. I think they're probably big listeners. I can only imagine Karen Levitt loves the Guilty Feminist. I'm a feminist, but I've deported 29 women and 4 girls this morning. Oh, what am I like?
I was thinking about, and this isn't really a question, and I know that we've got to be careful about sort of putting our opinions into your mouths and whatnot, because we want you to continue doing these really amazing, important, vital investigations. But I was thinking about, and actually, Elizabeth, what you said about like how we're talking about Christianity and the fact that it sort of maps out this really great, vast historical narrative of its importance. And I think that when we are looking to politicians to give a message, having that large, huge historical backing of Christianity that sort of spans centuries and centuries means that you're voting for something that is far greater. It has a bigger, wider purpose than freeze rent. Like all of a sudden, all these really important things to our day to day are sort of put to the wayside because there's a grander scheme. There's the erasure of a certain kind of demographic, and that is what we need to focus on. Doesn't matter if in your lifetime you can't see a doctor or be able to pay your bills, because actually there's a much grander, loftier, godlike mission to how you use your vote. And I also think that so much of life right now, in terms of technology, in terms of the amount of choice that people have, that's great. But also I think that it gets to a point where it kind of freezes people. And being a part of a religion that isn't a religion, do you know what I mean? Like if you're going to vote for someone like Nigel Farage, you're not necessarily committing yourself to being somebody who is religious, but you are identifying with a tribe. And I think ultimately that's what people feel galvanized by parties like Reform, is that it feels greater than just, I want the streets to be clean. That all these really important things that affect our day to day are sort of being put to one side. And when you feel like you're a part of a big God determined revolution, you're going to want that, because right now everything about our lives is so fragmented and so isolated. So it just, I think exactly what you're saying, Deborah, in terms of in this country, we kind of proudly separate, church and state. So why is it turning? And I honestly think that there is so much about the environment, the petri dish that we live in now in society, that is turning people wanting to have bigger purpose. And so that's why these groups are gaining so much traction so fast. That's what I wanted to say.
I think it's
not a question.
Really, it's a really
if you have any thoughts,
important point, Susie. I mean, religion is extremely attractive for so many people precisely because of the bigger sense of relationship to the world, to the transcendent, beyond, right? literally Christianity transcends death. I mean, that is the story, right? So here, you can see very clearly the power, I think, of that external, literally transcendent message affecting American politics. And you can see it being very powerful, not only for people who deeply believe and structure their lives around those principles and communities, but also for politicians like President Trump, who have not built their lives around those principles and yet identify it as an unbelievably advantageous political force. I mean, the whole dynamic back and forth in the 2016 election, which, gosh, feels like ages ago when President Trump was elected the first time here. I can't tell you how many stories I wrote looking at, how does this work? The marriage between evangelicals and conservative Catholics who are devout and, espouse these principles that are not what President Trump seems to have stood for. I mean, he's been married 3 times. He's, all of these things that just
multiple children from multiple different baby mamas, which again, imagine if Hillary Clinton had had various children to various fathers.
The language, I mean, it goes on, just the principles of kindness in public speech, like all of these things. Don't need to relitigate them all here, but it was a political marriage, right, between the MAGA movement, that was attached to him, that was not religious, and the social conservative Christian political movement that saw in him an engine. I mean, if they attached themselves, it was a political calculus. If they attached themselves to him, they calculated that they would get a Supreme Court that would vote in their favor, which is precisely what happened. And so I think the broader public, and certainly many Democrats here, didn't see the power of that kind of marriage and the jet fuel. I mean, once something becomes kind of a holy war in the mind of the people, it becomes unstoppable. I mean, look at the Crusades. I mean, there's actual centuries, right, that have been defined by these kinds of things in the church and empire historically. And so unless you really take seriously that power is possible, I think it's hard to really comprehend what might happen and how change might happen.
How do we fight it, Elizabeth?
People ask me that, and I don't know if it's merciful for me, but that's not my job or Jane's job, right? As the investigative journalist, I mean, my role in this is to look at what is actually happening and uncover, to give the public the facts of this is what reality is. Like, this is what is going on, and to to put that out there. And I spend most of my time in these Christian communities interviewing people and trying to really learn the motivations and the why and the action and what is actually happening, and to understand that psychology and
so you have to be
it's
the neutral observer and questioner in a way.
It's also a real principle at the New York Times of journalistic independence. I want to be respected by the people that I interview for the truth that I tell. It's really important. And I will say too, I do think a lot of progressive readers or viewers of my work are really challenged by their preconceptions often of these communities, because there's often something very real that is motivating these actions. And I think it's really important to take that seriously.
There's a big community that really, really believes this is the right thing to do, that no matter what engine will get us there, we've got to get there. And there are also some, am I right in saying there are also some political players that are very happy to hitch their wagon to a Christian nationalist community to get where they're going?
Sure. I mean, politics is the reason they call it a dirty business, right? But I do think, especially when we're talking about abortion, we have to be clear. It's a minority. I mean, I think it's something around don't. This isn't quite exactly right, but it was something the last I checked about maybe around 8% of American adults believe that life begins at conception. There should be no abortion of any kind ever, right? But it's a distinct minority. But there are some really deeply held principles in many in that cohort about when I interview them, they talk about the dignity of the human person and wanting to carry that through consistently in their worldview from the beginning of a human person. I mean, they really believe, and this is part of Catholic teaching too, really believing that a human is a person at conception. We've written a lot about that and how to understand that from religious, scientific, political vantage points as well. But when you take that seriously, I mean, they are in their world trying to live out this belief, and the conflict is that we're in a pluralist society, and many more people don't see it that way. So then that's where you get into, well, how does power work in here?
And the difference between democracy and personal liberty.
Yeah, and bringing it back to the UK, look, the relationship between Nigel Farage and the ADF, or any wider US anti-abortion movement, is very similar to that of the Trump relationship that Elizabeth was describing. It's a marriage of political convenience. Like, I have not seen any evidence that Nigel Farage actually cares about abortion, and all the people I know inside Reform have said that's not really what he cares about, and actually he was quite pissed that our story centered on abortion as much as it did. For Reform and the ADF in this case, speaking about the anti-abortion movement through them, there is a political convenience to both of them. One, the ADF has, incredibly good connections and influence within the White House and within the US, which Reform, certainly at the start of the year when their relationship really kind of picked up, was very keen to utilize. And for them, Farage could very well be the next prime minister, and is topping the polls and beating Labour and the Conservatives. So in a country where they don't have that political influence or relationships, if they can jump onto that power and that slipstream of that power early on as the party and Farage is on the rise, that's very useful for them. Particularly if he does, become prime minister, then they could have a very powerful ally in Westminster, the same as they do with Trump and Vance in the US.
How much funding do you think they're giving him?
Oh, so I found no evidence of them giving him, the ADF giving Reform, any money yet. And it would have to be declared in all the usual transparency arrangements. But when we look at kind of power and influence and money, usually the relationship comes before any money, right? So we've really caught the ADF and Reform Farage at the genesis of their relationship. So there's no evidence money's changed hands yet. What this is at, the stage it's at least this year, is kind of the building up of allies and relationships. And maybe that will translate to money. We know the ADF have deep pockets in future, but that's not something we know of yet.
And it's also, I mean, how does one calculate the monetary value of the kind of religious motivation that these groups can generate, right? I mean, it's a hugely valuable political asset.
Yes, it exactly, that sort of heft and that weight. It's something that we're very interested in, is how our churches are changing and how our churches have not been Christian nationalists, but we're seeing signs of that in some of our churches. And of course, like your leaders of your churches in America, some are fighting it, some are going with it. is there anything else that we should be alert to or aware of that's happening in America that could start happening here with those alliances being made that we should just know about as concerned and interested citizens who are interested in democracy and wish to keep church and state apart as they are now?
I mean, one of the things I would just add in the mix or reiterate is, it is one of the lessons that I found in really reporting and investigating how the anti-abortion movement and conservative Christian coalitions successfully ended the constitutional right to abortion here, is, well, a couple things. One, they didn't just have one strategy, right? They had many avenues to try to, throw different legal strategies, political strategies, cultural strategies to see what would ultimately work. And so it really was, they were sort of elevating the bottom line on everything to sort of see which would become most successful to rise the vote first. And it can be tempting, I think, to think, oh, if this one thing hadn't happened, if Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a former or late Supreme Court justice, she hadn't died, would Roe not have been overturned, or if Trump hadn't been elected? I mean, all of these kinds of things. And I think it's helpful to see it. Well, actually, like, it's the whole network. It's how all these things work together over time, and the shared motivational principles, which were largely religious motive and specifically, Christianity motivating this. And it was really hard for people to see. It just seemed so unfathomable. I mean, Roe had been the law of the land here, or the guiding constitutional principle for several generations. So it was hard for anyone to actually process that it could happen. And with you all kindly mentioned, I wrote a book about this, and we found a lot in there. My co-author Lisa Lair and I, she's also one of our colleagues at the New York Times. We reflected a lot on the power of belief versus the power of denial, and the function that can play in a society. And really, it doesn't take a majority to change history, right? That's not actually how it works. In this case, the lesson was there was a very dedicated minority that found power in exactly the right places to pull those levers of power, both at the local government level, all the way up, to the White House, and in every cultural avenue. And when you have those lever pulls in exactly the right places, you do not need more than that. So while it was also important for the anti-abortion movement to raise the cultural profile of their issue, they also were effective in creating an impression that they were far more culturally relevant, I think, and that more people shared their views than actually did. I mean, once Roe fell, that spell was broken, and people could see, oh wait, I mean, they like had a huge political backlash against them. Was we'll see how long lasting that is here, right? But I think it's just, you can't really overstate that enough. That the reality of how power actually works, especially when this kind of Christian power is involved, it's extraordinarily strong.
Yes, I think we need to get much better at analysing what they're doing and how they're doing it, and understanding it, because it isn't just about political will, it is about strategy and organisation, and unfortunately it's also about money, which they tend to have more of. Susan?
Yeah. Yes, what you said, Jane, in terms of the ADF and reform Farage, and there not actually being any evidence of there being an exchange of money. And when we did the live show, Elizabeth, it really did feel like we had discovered this, or we were sharing this information, Deborah, didn't it? Really early, like we've caught it early, essentially. With the next general election being in 2029, do you think that we have caught this early? Do you think there is enough time to tackle this and uncover it and stop it in its tracks? Or is the long game for the ADF far longer than we can even possibly imagine? 2029 is not some kind of beacon year where they want things tied up. This is long game, because what it feels like in the States was that they were prepared to wait as long as they needed to achieve what they wanted. So I wondered what you both thought about that, whether we were ahead of the curve or whether
it's an
we're
interesting
doomed.
question, because Elizabeth and I were discussing this when we were reporting it. But when we first started investigating this story, looking into it, it was so hard to unravel the relationships and who had the power and what the dynamics were and who was setting up what meeting. And we realized kind of when we were further on, it was because this was really the start of it and these relationships were being built. And as we were reporting it, we had one meeting that we knew that ADF had secretly brokered. And then the next week, while we were still reporting, we'd learn of another meeting or another briefing that had been set up. So I think we definitely have reported on it kind of at the start of the relationship. As Elizabeth said earlier, like, thankfully kind of for us, it's not for us to kind of stop it, but what we want to do in all our kind of reporting is, you know, lift what's happening in the shadows, behind the scenes, behind closed doors, kind of in this veil of secrecy into the daylight. So at least people know it's happening. And I feel like that's my job as an investigative journalist, to put it on record that this is happening. If, you know, somebody's talking about X, did you know they had this relationship with Y, and things like that. So I feel like that's the first step in understanding kind of power and influence and kind of any trends around this. I think in terms of the ADF, Elizabeth will be able to speak more to this, but yeah, they think in generational terms, like we kind of chat about in the live show. 2029 feels like a long way away, and it will certainly be, I imagine, one of the markers they've got in mind, particularly with a focus on Farage. But they'll be thinking far longer term than that. And Elizabeth, you might want to kind of add to that.
No, I absolutely, I agree with what she said. I mean, I sort of wonder, okay, so say or people who are against this, you know, feel like, oh, we conquered this in 2029. And so, like, we did it, it's done. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've interviewed abortion rights activists here who feel like they did that over time, and then just kind of, especially maybe not the activists also so much, but the Democratic Party, right? The political will, like, beyond that, there was a real tendency to think, oh, it's done. And that's not really how this works. This is, I mean, I know I will be covering this kind of thing probably throughout my career. I can't, that's part of the power in these Christian communities is the longevity of it. I mean, it's an institution broadly, right, that has survived all kinds of centuries, right? So I think it's really hard sometimes as people to see the moment you're in, like when you're actually in it. That's why looking back and understanding, you know, how does this work over time? How do we get here? Is a really valuable and important thing.
Well, thank you so much for the work that you're doing, and please, as and when you have any other information or any other discoveries, we would absolutely love you to come back to the Guilty Feminist anytime, even if it's just for like a little 20-minute update. Anything at all that you know, we would love to know. We're doing these Road to Gilead. We've just completing the first season of Road to Gilead, but we want to start a new one in the new year. And in the interim, anything we need to add on or talk about, or we would absolutely love to have you both on again. You're such an asset, and you're such a mine of information, and we really appreciate the work that you're doing.
Well, thank you so much.
This has definitely been the funnest podcast I've ever been on.
Yeah.
Sorry to the other podcasts.
We love you too.
No, we're a very unusual mix of
You
comedy
have
and-
fun in it. There's lots of great
and,
podcasts. This is not a New York
exactly.
Times endorsement.
Thank you so much for joining us, Jane Bradley, woo! Elizabeth Dias, all the way from New York, Susan Wokoma. I've been Deborah Frances-White. We've been the Guilty Feminist, and this has been our Road to Gilead series. Thank you so much for joining us.